In this Lightroom video, we're going to have a look at how to use the HDR Merge command, and this allows us to combine different exposures of a scene to come up with an image with expanded dynamic range. And this can be really useful in scenes like this where we have a bright sky and quite dark land below. Now I've taken two exposures of this particular scene. If I go through here, you can see this is my first exposure, and here the land is quite nicely exposed, but that sky is too bright. If I go to my second exposure, you can see now the land is looking slightly too dark, but we've got a bit more detail that we can use in that sky. And I'll show you how we can combine these versions of our image using the HDR Merge command. So let's get cracking. If we go into Lightroom's Develop module here, and let's bring up our film strip here, so you can see I've got my two exposures here. And if we just have a look at this brighter exposure, we can see in our basic panel over here, I can hold Alt and drag whites here, and this gives me a view that shows clipped pixels. So you can see there are parts of the sky that are clipped to pure white in my brighter exposure, whereas in my slightly darker exposure here, I'll hold Alt and drag the whites, and now you can see no pixels are clipped. So I know there's detail that I can work with in that sky. Whereas with the lighter image here, we've got a better overall exposure of the land. So I'm going to highlight both frames here. I can hold Command on a Mac, Control on Windows, and click on each to do that. And before I use HDR Merge, I'm just going to go down here and go into my lens correction panel, and I'll make sure Remove Chromatic Aberration and Enable Profile Corrections are both checked here, just to apply some lens correction fixes to both of those frames. It's not really worth doing anything else using the other tools here in the Develop module, because most of the adjustments we make will be cancelled by using that HDR Merge command, but we can always apply lens correction before we begin. So now I'm ready to merge my two frames. So I can right click them here in the film strip, and I can go to Photo Merge, and I can use HDR, or I can use the keyboard shortcut Alt H. And after a few seconds, my merged HDR image will appear. And we have a few really simple settings here. We have an auto align option here at the top here, and this helps to correct for any slight misalignment between our frames. So for example, if the camera was nudged between our frames, then they might not match up perfectly. So we can use the auto align feature here to correct for that. You can also use it if you've shot a handheld set of photos for your HDR. As long as there's not too much movement between each individual frame, then the auto align can fix those slight discrepancies. Now there's also an auto settings option here. We can uncheck that or check it, and this just applies an auto tonal fix. Now this is sort of non-destructive because we can always go into our basic panel and tweak the settings within there to change those auto settings later if we like. Now below this we have a de-ghost amount option here. We can set this to none, low, medium, or high. Now this feature helps us to correct for discrepancies between our frames. If parts of the frame are moving, like say swaying grass, or in this case moving water, then the de-ghost amount will choose one frame to work with for those moving areas. And if I check show de-ghost overlay, you can see at the moment it's detected movement in these areas here. If we change this to high, you can see it picks up more movement in these areas of the frame, but I think for this image, medium will be fine. And I'm happy with those settings, so I'll hit merge. And you can see the progress of the HDR being created up in the top left here. Now, of course, I'm merging two frames here, but you can use this same command to merge 3 or more frames in exactly the same way. Now, notice in my film strip here how my images have been stacked on top of one another. So I can click the little icon here to open up the stack, and you can see we have the HDR version of our image alongside the two original frames. So now if we go to our basic panel here, you can see we have a few settings that have already been input, and this is because we checked that auto settings option in the HDR Merge command. So we can go on and tweak those settings if we want to adjust the image using these sliders here in the basic panel. And notice here that our exposure slider that normally goes to plus or minus 4 can now go to plus or minus 10. So that just gives you an idea of the expanded dynamic range that we're able to work with here. And notice also that our combined HDR image here is a RAW file. It's in the Adobe DNG RAW format. And that means, like any other RAW file, we can tweak the white balance after the fact if we like. And then we can go on to enhance the image in the same way as we would with any image, but with that expanded dynamic range to work with. So for example, I could perhaps increase the clarity just to crunch up the detail a little bit. And I'd like to pull a bit more detail out of this sky. So I'm going to use the graduated filter for this and just drag down from sky towards land like that. I can hit O to view the mask overlay, and I want to subtract these areas over the cliffs here. So I'm going to go to my brush tool here, and I'll make sure it's set to erase here in the brush tool options. I'll also check auto mask so that the brush sort of snaps onto the edges of the cliffs here, and I'll quickly whiz over this area to subtract this from the adjustment that I'm going to make in a second. So I'll subtract the cliffs around this side of the frame as well, just by quickly painting over them with that erase feature within the graduated filter tool. Then with that done, I can hit O to hide the overlay, and at the moment it's remembering the last used settings. I can just double click effect here at the top to reset those existing settings and then apply some new settings. So I'm going to drag down on exposure to darken the sky. Let's perhaps increase the contrast a touch as well. And we could also try boosting clarity just to pull a bit more detail out of the area like that. And then I could perhaps finish off by adjusting the tones here. In fact, I'm going to go to my profile options and change this to landscape, which just boosts the greens in the grass there. Let's perhaps boost them slightly more by upping the vibrance and saturation. Let's add a touch more contrast and drop the shadows a touch, and I'm happy with that. So there we go. That's how to use the HDR Merge command in Lightroom to combine several exposures for a high dynamic range image.